I still remember standing in the middle of a high-end kitchen store on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was holding a professional-grade espresso machine that cost $549. I did not even drink that much espresso. But as I looked at the price tag, I was not thinking about the cost. I was not thinking about whether I had $500 to spare in my budget that month. I was thinking about the 4,000 bonus points I would get if I put it on my travel rewards card. In my head, I was already halfway to a free flight to London. I told myself that by buying this machine, I was actually being smart. I was gaming the system. I was getting something for nothing. What I did not know at the time was that the $500 leaving my bank account was real, but the value I was getting back was a carefully constructed illusion. That was the moment I realized this was not a perk. This was a trap. My name is David, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the hidden psychological triggers that banks use to keep us spending money we do not have on things we do not need. If you are someone who meticulously tracks your points, or if you feel a little rush of pride every time you unlock a new tier of a rewards program, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Because today, I am not talking about how to maximize your point redemption or which card has the best sign-up bonus. I want to talk about the massive hidden tax you are paying every single time you swipe that shiny metal card. I want to talk about the math that the banks hope you never actually do, and I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. I spent years of my life convinced that I was one of the smart ones. I had the spreadsheets. I knew the transfer partners. I bragged to my friends about how I flew to Mexico for $60 and a handful of points, but when I finally sat down and looked at my net worth instead of my points balance, I saw a very different story. I realized that the more I focused on the rewards, the more my actual wealth was stagnating. I was winning the battle of the points but losing the war of the wealth. I started to look into why a multi-billion-dollar industry would give away free flights and hotel stays for doing nothing more than spending money. And what I found changed everything about how I look at my wallet. I discovered that there is a specific name for what I was experiencing. I did not have a name for it back then, but when I finally went looking, I found out it was called the Rewards Mirage. It is a psychological and mathematical framework designed to decouple the pain of paying from the pleasure of purchasing. I stumbled onto this concept while reading a 2021 study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The researchers were looking at the neural pathways in the brain when people make purchases. I used to think that a dollar was a dollar, whether it was a paper bill or a digital transaction. But the data proved me completely wrong. The study showed that credit cards actually sensitize the reward centers of the brain. When I used cash, my brain registered a sense of loss. When I used my rewards card, that signal was almost entirely muted. I found a 2021 report from the Federal Reserve that showed credit card companies spent over $12 billion on rewards and marketing in a single year. I had to stop and think about that number. $12 billion. If the rewards were truly a gift to the consumer, the banks would be out of business. But they are not. They are more profitable than ever. I realized that I was not the customer in this scenario. I did not know it had a name until I started really digging into this, but the Rewards Mirage is the only reason these massive banks can afford to put their logos on stadiums. When I first heard the term, I thought it just meant that points were hard to redeem. I thought it was about the blackout dates or the confusing conversion charts. But it goes much deeper than that. The Mirage is the fundamental belief that you are getting a discount on your life, when in reality, you are paying a premium for the privilege of spending. I remember the night I found the source of this whole system. I was falling down a rabbit hole of consumer psychology, and I came across the work of Drazen Prelec and Duncan Simister. They are researchers who performed one of the most famous studies on credit card behavior at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They took a group of people and put them in a real-world bidding environment for basketball tickets. Some people were told they had to pay with cash. Others were told they could use a credit card. Before I read the results, I assumed the bids would be pretty similar. After all, a ticket is worth what it is worth. Right? I was wrong. The people using credit cards bid nearly twice as much as the people using cash. Specifically, the average credit card bid was over 100% higher than the cash bid. When I read that, I felt a physical pang in my chest. I thought about all the times I had opted for the slightly more expensive hotel room or the better seat at a concert because I was using my card. I thought I was being rational, but the math showed that my brain was literally being hijacked by the plastic in my pocket. That was layer one of the trap. I realized that the friction of physical money acts as a speed bump for our spending. When I have to reach into my wallet and physically hand over a $50 bill, my brain processes that as a loss. There is a psychological pain associated with it. But when I used my rewards card to buy that $549 espresso machine, there was no pain. There was only the positive reinforcement of the points notification on my phone. The bank had successfully removed the pain of payment and replaced it with a hit of dopamine. I used to believe that if I was disciplined, I could avoid this. I told myself that the statistics did not apply to me because I was a math guy. I was a spreadsheet guy. But then I found a study from Dun & Bradstreet that blew up that belief. They found that people spend 12 to 18% more when using credit cards instead of cash for the exact same items. I did the math on my own income at the time. I was earning $72,000 a year. If I was overspending by even 15% because of the credit card friction effect, that meant I was throwing away nearly $10,000 a year just to chase a few $100s worth of airline miles. That was the moment I realized the scale of the mistake I was making. I was obsessing over a 2% cashback rate while ignoring a 15% behavioral markup. It was like I was bending over to pick up a penny while a $20 bill was falling out of my back pocket. And the worst part was, I was doing it to myself. I was the one who had signed the contract. I was the one who had convinced myself that I was winning. But the first layer of the mirage was finally starting to fade, and what I saw underneath was even more unsettling. I used to think I had a handle on my spending because I checked my banking app every morning. I would see my balance, look at my recent transactions, and feel like everything was under control. But as I started peeling back the layers of my own behavior, I realized I was a victim of what economists call the decoupling effect. This is the first full layer of the rewards mirage, and it is where the math really started to fall apart for me. In my mind, the purchase and the payment were two completely separate events. When I bought a dinner for $85, I felt the pleasure of the meal immediately. But I did not feel the weight of the $85 until 30 days later when the bill arrived. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one Sunday afternoon with a stack of bank statements from the previous 6 months. I was 28 years old, and I was frustrated that my savings account was not growing despite my decent salary. I decided to do a forensic audit of my own life. I looked at a single week of spending on my rewards card. On Monday, I spent $6 on a coffee and a pastry. On Tuesday, I spent $42 on a random Amazon purchase for a desk organizer I saw in a video. On Wednesday, I spent $94 on a grocery haul that included way too many high-end snacks I only bought because I saw they were on sale. By the time I reached the end of the month, I had spent $1,400 on what I called miscellaneous expenses. If I had been forced to take $1,400 in cash out of an automated teller machine at the beginning of the month and hand over those physical bills for every single one of those purchases, I know for a fact I would not have bought half of that stuff. The decoupling effect allowed me to spend money I had not even earned yet. I was living in a future version of my reality, where I was rich in points but poor in actual liquidity. The numbers were staggering when I looked at them in total. I found a study from the Journal of Consumer Research that explained exactly what was happening to my brain. It turns out that credit cards do not just make us spend more, they make us remember the cost of things less accurately. When the researchers asked people to recall how much they had spent after a shopping trip, the cash users were almost always within 5% of the actual total. The credit card users, however, consistently underestimated their spending by 20% or more. I was one of those people. I would have guessed I spent about $800 on those miscellaneous items. The reality was nearly double that. I was paying a massive premium for the convenience of not having to think about money. The banks have spent decades and billions of dollars to make the transaction process as invisible as possible. From the magnetic stripe, to the chip reader, to the tap to pay on my phone, every innovation was designed to reduce the friction of the sale. And for me, the rewards were the ultimate friction reducer. Every time I felt a tiny bit of guilt for spending money I should have been saving, I would look at the points I was earning and tell myself it was an investment. I was telling myself a lie to protect my ego. What I finally had to admit to myself was that I was not using the card for the rewards. I was using the rewards to justify the card. I was trapped in a cycle where my spending was dictated by the dopamine hit of the transaction rather than the utility of the product. And as I looked at the interest rates and the annual fees that were quietly ticking away in the background, I realized that the trap went even deeper than just overspending. I was about to discover that the points themselves were a currency designed to lose value the moment I earned them. I used to think of my points like a secondary savings account. I would log into my portal, see a balance of 120,000 points, and tell myself that I had about $1,200 sitting there for a rainy day. I felt secure. But then I started looking into the mechanics of what the industry calls breakage and devaluation. This is layer 2 of the Rewards Mirage, and it is the part where the bank reminds you that they own the board, the dice, and the rules of the game. I remember one specific morning when I went to book a flight to see my parents. I had been saving my points for months to cover this specific trip. When I had checked the year before, the flight was 25,000 points. But when I logged in that morning, the exact same route was now 40,000 points. Nothing about the flight had changed. The distance was the same. The airline was the same. But the bank had decided, with no warning and no explanation, that my points were now worth 35% less than they were the day before. I realized that points are a currency where the central bank is a for-profit corporation that can devalue your savings whenever they need to hit their quarterly earnings targets. I found a report from 2022 showing that major airlines and credit card issuers frequently adjust their redemption charts, often resulting in a 6 to 10% annual decrease in the purchasing power of a single point. If a regular bank told you they were going to take 10% of your savings every year just because they felt like it, you would close the account immediately. But because it is hidden behind the language of points and miles, I let it slide. Then there is the concept of breakage. This is a term I found in a retail industry white paper that made my blood run cold. Breakage refers to the percentage of rewards that are earned by consumers but never actually redeemed. I used to think that the banks hated it when people did not use their points. I was wrong. They love it. Every point that expires or sits unused on a forgotten account is pure profit for them. I found an industry estimate from 2021 suggesting that nearly 30% of all loyalty points are never redeemed. That represents billions of dollars in value that consumers worked for, spent for, and sacrificed for, which simply vanished back into the bank's coffers. I looked at my own history and realized I was a contributor to that 30%. I had several cards with small balances of 4,000 or 5,000 points, not enough to buy anything meaningful, but just enough to keep me from closing the account and paying the annual fee for one more year. I was being held hostage by my own small change. I was paying $95 a year in annual fees just to protect $50 worth of points that were losing value every single day. When I sat down to do the math, I realized that the bank was winning on both ends. They were winning because I was spending 12 to 18% more than I would with cash, and they were winning again because the points they gave me to encourage that spending were being systematically devalued or left to rot. I was playing a game where the currency was designed to melt in my hands, and as I looked at the interest rates attached to these cards, I realized that for many people, the points were not just melting, they were actually a gateway into a much more dangerous financial fire. I used to believe that as long as I paid my statement in full every month, I was immune to the real costs of the credit card industry. I viewed myself as a sophisticated player who was essentially stealing from the banks. But when I finally did the forensic accounting on my own life, I realized I was ignoring layer 3 of the trap. This is the part that took me years to find, because it is buried in the fine print and the annual fee structure that we often dismiss as the cost of doing business. I remember one year specifically where I was obsessed with a premium travel card that had a $450 annual fee. I justified it because I got a $300 travel credit and a $100 credit for a luxury gym membership I already used. In my head, I was paying $50 for a card that gave me lounge access and 5 times the points on dining. I felt like a genius. But then I looked at the actual math of my interest rates and the missed opportunity of that cash. I found a 2023 report from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that stopped me in my tracks. It showed that credit card companies earned over $105 billion in interest and fees in a single year. Of that, over $25 billion came specifically from fees like annual charges and late payments. I realized that the rewards programs are not funded by the kindness of the banks. They are funded by a massive transfer of wealth from people who carry a balance to people who do not. And for a long time, I thought I was on the winning side of that transfer. But then I sat down and looked at my own behavior during a month where I had a minor emergency. My car needed a new transmission that cost $3,200. Because I had been so focused on spending to earn points, my cash savings were lower than they should have been. I could not pay the full statement that month. For the first time in years, I carried a balance. My interest rate was 24%. In just 60 days, I paid over $120 in interest alone. That one moment of friction wiped out every single point I had earned over the previous 6 months. I realized that the banks are not just betting on you being a bad manager of money. They are betting on the fact that life is unpredictable. They create a high-stakes environment where one mistake, one car repair, or one medical bill turns you from a rewards winner into an interest-paying profit center. I was playing a game of musical chairs with my finances, and the music was the points. As long as the music played, I was fine. But the moment it stopped, I was the one left without a seat, paying 24% interest on a balance that was artificially inflated by my pursuit of miles. When I calculated the lifetime cost, the numbers were even worse. I was 28 years old, and I was paying an average of $300 a year in various annual fees across 3 different cards. If I had simply invested that $300 a year into a basic index fund with a 7% return, over a 40-year working life, that would have turned into nearly $65,000. I was trading $65,000 of my future wealth for some mediocre airport salads and a couple of domestic flights. The math did not just look bad. It looked like a catastrophe. I was finally seeing the hidden cost of the Rewards Mirage. It was not just the extra 12% I was spending at the store. It was not just the devaluation of my points. It was the massive opportunity cost of the fees and the looming threat of high-interest debt that I was inviting into my life every single day. I realized that the heaviest part of the trap was not the money I was losing today, but the wealth I was preventing myself from building tomorrow. I reached a point where I had to stop looking at my monthly statements and start looking at my entire life. I decided to run a lifetime math comparison to see what the Rewards Mirage was actually costing me over the long haul. I sat down with a blank spreadsheet and built 2 versions of my future self. The first version was David the Points Chaser. The second version was David the Cash User. In the first scenario, I stayed on the path I was on. I was earning $72,000 a year. I was spending roughly $30,000 a year on my credit cards to earn those precious points. Based on the data from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the 12 to 18% overspending rule, I had to admit that at least $3,600 of that spending was pure waste. It was stuff I only bought because the friction of the transaction was gone. Add in $300 a year in annual fees and the occasional interest charge when life got messy. Total annual leak, $4,000. In the second scenario, I cut up the cards. I switched to a debit card and physical cash. My spending immediately dropped because I felt the sting of every dollar leaving my hand. I no longer paid annual fees. I no longer risked 24% interest. I took that $4,000 a year in savings and I put it into a simple retirement account. I projected both paths over 30 years. I assumed a conservative 7% annual return. In the first path, I had a lot of nice memories of business class seats and upgraded hotel rooms. I probably had a collection of high-end kitchen gadgets like that $500 espresso machine. But in the second path, the math was undeniable. That $4,000 a year, compounded over 3 decades, turned into $408,000. I sat there and stared at that number for a long time. $408,000. That was the price of my loyalty to a bank. That was the real cost of the Rewards Mirage. I was trading nearly $500,000 of my ultimate freedom for a few $1,000s worth of travel perks. I realized that the bank was not giving me free flights. I was paying for those flights with my retirement. I was paying for them with my peace of mind. I was paying for them with years of my life that I would have to spend working instead of being free. I found a 2022 study by researchers at the University of Chicago that looked at the distribution of these rewards. They found that the average reward card user is actually subsidizing the banking system's overhead while simultaneously inflating their own cost of living. Even if you are the 1% of people who never pays a cent in interest, you are still participating in a system that has raised the price of every single item you buy. Merchants bake the 2 or 3% credit card processing fees into their prices. When I used my rewards card, I thought I was getting a discount. In reality, I was just paying the hidden tax that the card itself created. The gap between these two paths was not just a financial one, it was a psychological one. On the first path, I was always chasing. I was always checking my balance. I was always looking for the next deal. On the second path, there was a level of simplicity I had forgotten existed. I realized that the greatest reward any financial system can give you is not a free flight to London. It is the ability to look at your bank account and know that every dollar in there belongs to you, not a future version of a credit card bill. The math showed me that I was being robbed, but the psychology explained why I was standing there holding the door open for the thief. I used to believe that my overspending was a character flaw. I told myself I just lacked willpower or that I needed a better budgeting app. But as I dove deeper into the psychological dimension of the Rewards Mirage, I realized I was fighting a war against a multi-billion-dollar neurobiology department. I was not just using a tool. I was interacting with a platform designed to exploit the way my brain evolved to process rewards. I remember the feeling of getting a notification on my phone that I had just earned double points on a dinner out. It felt like a small win. I discovered that this is not an accident. It is called gamification. The banks have taken the same psychological principles used in slot machines and mobile games and applied them to our spending. Every time I saw a progress bar toward a sign-up bonus, my brain released a hit of dopamine. I was no longer shopping for food or clothes. I was playing a game where the high score was my points balance. I found a fascinating study from the 1970s by researchers Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell regarding the hedonic treadmill. They explained that humans have a base level of happiness that we quickly return to after a positive event. When I got that free flight, I felt a rush of euphoria, but within 48 hours of landing back home, that feeling was gone. However, the habit of overspending that I had developed to earn that flight remained. I was running faster and faster on the treadmill of consumption, but my actual satisfaction with life was staying exactly the same. The banks know this better than anyone. They use what I call the notification loop to keep the trap active. In the old days, you would spend money and maybe see a paper statement once a month. Now, the feedback is instant. Every swipe is followed by a ping, a digital gold star that tells you that you did a good job by spending money. I realized that this was conditioning me to associate spending with achievement. Instead of feeling the loss of my $72,000 salary, I was feeling the gain of a few hundred virtual points. I also saw how the industry uses choice architecture to manipulate our decisions. When I looked at my redemption options, the most prominent buttons were always for things like gift cards or merchandise, where the value of a point is the lowest. The high-value travel transfers were buried deep in the menus, requiring hours of research to find. They make the spending part effortless and the benefit part exhausting. They know that most of us are tired after a 40-hour work week. They are betting on our mental fatigue. I remember sitting in my car after a long shift, looking at a notification for a sale at a clothing store. I did not need new clothes, but the app told me I could earn 10 times the points if I shopped through their portal that evening. I felt a physical pull in my gut to click that link. It was not logic, it was a conditioned response. I realized that the rewards program had turned my own brain into a salesman for the bank. I was being played by a system that knew my triggers better than I did. This psychological layering is why the trap is so hard to escape. Even when you see the math, the dopamine is still there. Even when you know you are overspending, the progress bar is still calling to you. I had to realize that I could not outsmart a system designed to bypass my logic and talk directly to my impulses. I had to stop trying to win the game and realize that the only way to win was to stop playing entirely. When someone first suggested that I should stop using rewards cards, my immediate reaction was defensive. I thought they were being dramatic. I told myself that the math did not apply to me because I was disciplined. I told myself that I was different because I paid my balance in full every single month. I know this sounds unrealistic, and I pushed back against this idea for years. I would argue that I was essentially getting a 2% discount on my entire life, and that the bank was paying for my vacations. I thought I was the one winning. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now, because it used to form in mine. You are probably thinking that if you are already going to spend the money anyway, you might as well get something back for it. You think that by switching to cash or a debit card, you are just leaving free money on the table. I used to say that exact same sentence to anyone who would listen. I felt like I was smarter than the system because I never paid a cent in interest. But here is the counterintuitive truth that I had to face. The idea that you are going to spend the money anyway is a total myth. It is the core lie that the Rewards Mirage is built on. I found a study from the Journal of Consumer Research that proved my own self-discipline was a fantasy. The researchers found that the mere presence of a credit card logo in a store or on a website increases the average person's willingness to spend. It is a subconscious trigger. I was not spending the same amount of money. I was making thousands of tiny micro decisions every month to spend just a little bit more because the friction was gone. I had to look at the data and realize that even the most disciplined payers are not immune to the behavioral shift. When I switched to a rewards card, my average grocery bill went up by $20. My average dinner out went up by $15. I was not buying different things. I was just saying yes to the appetizer more often. I was saying yes to the premium brand of laundry detergent. I was saying yes to things I would have questioned if I was looking at the physical 20s in my wallet. I also had to realize that my pursuit of points was actually making me a worse shopper. I was choosing where to eat based on which restaurant gave me 4 times the points, rather than which one had the best value. I was flying on airlines that cost $50 more because I wanted to stay loyal to my points ecosystem. I was overpaying for the base product just to get a tiny fraction of that overpayment back in the form of a reward. It was a circular logic that only benefited the bank. I finally had to admit that I was not a sophisticated player. I was a customer who had been successfully marketed to. The bank was not losing money on me. They were using me as a high-volume spender to collect interchange fees from every merchant I visited. I was the engine of their profit, not the beneficiary of their charity. Once I accepted that my discipline was not enough to overcome the deep psychological design of the system, I was finally ready to look for a way out. The first thing I did was something that felt incredibly painful at the time. I took my primary travel rewards card, the one with the heavy metal weight and the premium branding, and I put it in a kitchen drawer. I did not close the account yet because I was afraid of the credit score impact, but I committed to a 30-day cash-only experiment. I went to my bank on a Monday morning and I withdrew $500 in physical $20 bills. That was my entire budget for everything except rent and utilities for the next 2 weeks. I still remember the first time I went to the grocery store during that experiment. Usually, I would walk through the aisles tossing things into the cart without a second thought. I would see a $30 bottle of olive oil and think about the triple points I would earn on groceries. But that day, as I stood in the aisle with $20 bills in my pocket, that olive oil felt like a massive sacrifice. I looked at the bottle, then I looked at the cash in my hand, and I put the bottle back. I bought the $12 version instead. In that one moment, I saved $18. To earn $18 in credit card rewards at a 2% return rate, I would have had to spend $900. The first signs of escape started to show up in my banking app within just 10 days. For the first time in my adult life, my checking account balance was not dropping at a terrifying rate. Because I was using cash, every transaction was a conscious choice. I found a study from the Journal of Experimental Psychology that explains exactly what I was feeling. It is called the pain of payment. When we use physical cash, the brain registers the transaction in the same area that processes physical pain. By reintroducing that pain, I was finally able to see the true cost of my lifestyle. I realized that my spending had dropped by 22% in the very first month. I went from spending roughly $2,800 a month on my lifestyle to just under $2,200. I had saved $600 in 30 days just by changing the way I paid. To get $600 back from my rewards card, I would have had to spend $30,000. The math was so lopsided that I felt embarrassed I had ever fallen for the Mirage in the first place. The second step I took was to perform a points liquidation. I stopped hoarding my miles for some hypothetical future trip that might be devalued next month. I spent 3 hours one evening mapping out exactly how to get the most value out of my existing balance. I turned my points into travel vouchers for a trip I actually needed to take for work, and I used the cash I would have spent on that flight to jumpstart my emergency fund. I was turning my virtual play money back into real-world security. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders as my points balance hit zero. I was no longer checking the portals. I was no longer reading the newsletters. I was finally out of the game. The third thing I changed was my definition of a win. I realized that my net worth was the only score that actually mattered. Once I saw that my spending had naturally dropped by $600 a month just by removing the rewards cards from my wallet, I took that exact amount and set up an automatic transfer to my brokerage account. I was no longer waiting for a bank to give me a 2% kickback. I was giving myself a 22% raise. Step 4 was the final break. I called the card issuers and closed the accounts with annual fees. I ignored the retention offers. I ignored the warnings about my credit score. I found a study from the 2023 financial reports showing that a credit score is primarily a measure of how good you are at being a customer for a bank, not how wealthy you are. I decided I would rather have $400,000 in the bank and a slightly lower credit score than a perfect score and no savings. Within 6 months, my credit score had actually stabilized because my debt-to-income ratio was better than it had ever been. The final step I took was simplifying my entire financial life. I moved to a system where I use a simple debit card for my fixed expenses and physical cash for my variable spending like food and entertainment. The mental clarity this provided was worth more than any first-class upgrade I had ever received. I no longer had to track multiple statement closing dates or worry about points expiring. I was finally in control of my own capital. When I look at the math now, the lifetime results are staggering. By saving that $600 a month and investing it over a 30-year period at a 7% return, I am on track to have over $700,000 more than if I had stayed on the points treadmill. That is the difference between retiring at 55 or working until I am 70. When I look at that espresso machine in my kitchen now, I do not see 4,000 points. I see the $500 that it actually cost me, and I see the thousands of dollars in future growth I sacrificed to buy it. The core emotional truth I had to learn is that there is no such thing as a free lunch in a capitalist system. If a multi-billion-dollar company is giving you something for free, it is because they have calculated that you will give them back much more in return. They are betting on your impulses, your ego, and your inability to do the math. I spent a decade being the perfect customer. I am spending the rest of my life being the owner of my own future. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.